Hello and welcome to Leftover Master. Today is our inaugural event. We're going to be making some meal out of leftovers. I got home early from work today, and so I'm on duty. And as with many people in the household, a lot of these things will shift back and forth depending on what people's work schedules are. Our goal is to try and make use of leftovers, whatever they may be. And sometimes you just got to open up the fridge, see what's inside, and see what you can make. I did a little bit of preliminary scouting earlier before I came up with this episode, and we're going to make a shepherd's pie today. We've got some leftover potatoes, some leftover meat from a roast a couple days ago. And interesting, this dish actually originated way back in the 1700s. People back then were going through the same thing that people are going through now, trying to figure out what to do with leftover dishes. Maybe the kids are coming home from working long days in the field, and they say, "Mom, you know what? We're just tired of that leftover fried mutton again. What do you got for us different this time around?" Well, we're going to see what we can do with those leftovers. What we're doing on leftovers, again, we're coming up with things. A lot of this is unscripted. We're just trying to figure out what we're going to do and make a meal. We make no apologies. So one of the things, if you're a leftover master, you don't apologize for taste. You don't apologize for looks. You try to make it taste good. You try to make it look good. Do the best that you can. So one of the things you have to do is get to the fridge. Once you're in the fridge, and again, no apologies. This is what a refrigerator looks like in most homes. If you open up a refrigerator on a cooking show, it's amazing. They're clean and everything's perfect and they have just the right amount of everything. This is a real person's actual refrigerator. And again, I did some preliminary scouting. We had some leftover roast, which we're going to use. We had some of the broth and the juices that went along with that, and we'll probably figure out something to do with that. We had some leftover boiled potatoes, so we'll probably add that. I was going to do some celery, but it looks like the kids might have eaten that as a snack, so we don't have any celery. That's okay, we'll make do. A lot of times I'll just add an onion just for a little bit extra flavor and get some of those sauteed flavors in there, so we'll add that. And then I did find a bag of mostly eaten mixed vegetables. We'll see if this is enough. I might have to add something to it, but this is a good starting point. We'll use up a lot of our leftovers, and hopefully we can make a decent meal out of that. So part of putting a meal together is just doing some timing of that meal. I'm going to try and do some of the cooking. The other thing that I do a lot is before I even start, I try to clean off a workspace. I know that sometimes that's not always possible. I always run a sink of dishes too. So you might see me kind of dipping my hands in here. A lot of times I'm just washing or rinsing off my hands. A lot of times when you're cooking, it's a good idea, if you can, to try and do some of the dishes as you go. It makes it just a little bit easier, less cleanup when you're done, and makes it just a little bit more efficient. Part of this is trying to use up leftovers. Part of this is trying to get a meal together with those leftovers when you have busy things going on in your life as well. So I'm going to take this beef, which actually was cooked down pretty good, but we're going to try and work on shredding it a little bit more. And this is part of our base. Now again, with a classic shepherd's pie, what people were doing back then with shepherd's pie is typically using lamb or mutton. And cottage pie is actually the dish where you use beef instead. But nobody's ever heard of cottage pie, and so everybody's heard of shepherd's pie. So even though in this country, for the most part, we're using beef to make a lot of our dishes, certainly you could use lamb. You could use leftover hamburger if you had that sitting around, depending on what else was in the hamburger. So I'm just going to cut this up into fine pieces. We'll put this in the pan, let it start going a little. I've got the meat going in the pan, and again, some of that we're just heating it up. It's already cooked, so it doesn't need to be cooked through again. There's no raw meat. We're just going to try and start warming that up a little bit. I found that little tub of juices. Now the nice thing about leftovers, sometimes it's almost easier to take care of some of the fatty stuff. This is gross, this is nasty, this is fat. It kind of floats to the surface, sits in the refrigerator overnight. Makes it really easy to kind of clean up and throw that away. Also, as you know, we're working in a natural environment here, so I got the dog in here helping me out. Got a cat watching me. Try to keep the dog out of the beef as we're working. So we may use some of this, a little added flavor. So we'll set that aside. I just want to get rid of the fat. A lot of times I'll use onion as a flavor filler. And so sometimes you can use, like I said, some leftover celery. Ended up being out of that today. But certainly putting in an onion is really no big deal. So a lot of times with that, we're just getting ready, doing a lot of our prep work. Now, this is not a fancy cooking show. I'm not an expert. I have zero training in cooking whatsoever. But I like to cook a little bit and put some dishes together. So one of the things I'll do, get this onion ready. I'm going to get this going in a separate pan because then we can use that and potentially add that to our meat and vegetables as we're cooking them. So as always, we can throw that in there, turn it down a bit. Put some butter in there just so we can kind of get those sauteing. And again, we're cleaning up as we go. So if I have time to attend to things, I'll do that. But sometimes I'll just leave things on low. And that way things can kind of be cooking while I'm doing other things as well. You always just got to keep one eye over here, just so things don't burn too much. All right, and we'll let that start to sizzle. All of our vegetables are going to go in there as well. So I've got my onions simmering in butter. I've got my meat that's just warming up. Now, depending on what vegetables you're going to use, that determines when you're going to throw them in with the vegetable butter mixture. If you're using raw carrots and raw celery, that takes a while to cook. If you're using frozen vegetables, or maybe you have some cooked vegetables that are in the refrigerator, if you're using those, they won't take much time because they're already pre-cooked a bit. So I go ahead and throw those in after the onions have been going for a while. And again, we're just going to kind of saute those up, get a little bit of extra flavor. And we'll see, that was a pretty meager amount of vegetables, so we'll kind of see how that mixes in with the meat and then decide if we need to add any more. So we're just taking a little bit of thaw out of that, getting a little bit of flavor mixed in. And again, while that's going, I'm going to get going with the potatoes. So in a shepherd's pie, it's basically a casserole. And in that casserole, we've got a mixture of potatoes that go on top and a meat and vegetable layer on the bottom. So one of the things I'm going to do is to mash these potatoes. I may start by just pre-mashing them, but I really want them nice and whipped. So I'll start by just getting them nice and small, probably add a little bit of milk and maybe a little bit of melted butter even, and then we'll whip those up. You could use any potatoes. I've got some baby reds that we used. If you had mashed potatoes, you wouldn't have to do anything with them other than maybe whip them up a little bit so that they spread easier. Certainly you could use Yukon Gold. Sweet potatoes would be interesting. Never done that, but that's the beauty of Leftover Masters, is each dish is created to some extent. We'll put recipes up on Leftover Master, but the recipes are always a little different every time. I've had several meals where I've gone through and people say, well, what was in that? And be like, honestly, I don't know. I had a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and if I try to reproduce it again, it always tastes a little bit different. So beauty of Leftover Master is that you can do pretty much whatever you want with some variation. So I've got my potatoes kind of started to mash up a little bit. I noticed that they were kind of dry, and I really want them whipped nicely, so I'm going to add some stuff to them, add a little bit of milk. I found some whole whipping cream, and cream just tastes good, so why not? We'll put that in there, and I melted a couple tablespoons of butter for the same reason. We'll just kind of get that all mixed in, mix things a little bit more whipped, a little bit more fluffy looking. maybe easier to spread on top of our meat mixture once we get that going. So that just took a couple of minutes. I wanted to spare you guys the spray from the potatoes, which went all over the place, but that can sometimes happen. We're not worried about it. We clean up as we go, and we clean up when we're done. But now we've got some nice potatoes. This will be our topping for the shepherd's pie. So after everything is done and mixed together, this will go on top. So while we did that, I again had the vegetables going, I had the meat going, and that's pretty much all warmed up at this point. Now the thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to combine them together, and this allows me to do a little bit of figuring out ratios too, just to make sure we got the right amount of everything. So now we've got our meat mixed together with our sauteed vegetables. I did end up going back to the freezer. Our vegetables looked a little bit on the thin side. Again, not really following a recipe, but trying to look at just the ratios of everything. And I ended up finding another unopened package of mixed vegetables. But honestly, if you had some corn, if you had some beans, if you whatever, just put that in there. Try and get your ratio right. Seasoning, a little bit different. Got salt, pepper, kind of standards. This is Herbes de Provence, which sounds really fancy, but it's actually just really common. But sometimes it gives a nice flavor, so I'll add a little bit of that. I'm going to wait on salt and pepper because if you remember, this was already a meal. So the roast was already seasoned. I want to avoid adding too much spice or too much salt. So I'm going to wait and see how it tastes, and I'll probably give it a little trial taste once I get everything mixed in. The other thing is we've got some natural broth that we're going to use. This was, again, part of the roast. This adds a ton of flavor, and there's also probably some salt mixed into that. So we'll hold off on the salt and pepper for now, see how this cooks down. This will give us some nice juiciness so the meal isn't too dry. Also, those potatoes are going to soak in a lot of that extra moisture as well. So I'm going to let this cook down. We'll give it a taste, and then we're ready for some assembly. So some people might be wondering where leftover master or leftover masters came from. That's what my kids call me. I certainly would never call myself that. I would come up with a much better, much cooler nickname if I was going to have one. But I do like to use things up. I don't like waste. I don't like throwing away food. So one of the things, even back in college, I was always coming up with different dishes and ways to not throw food away. So everyone has heard of Cake Masters and different sorts of cooking shows. So my kids started calling me Leftover Master, so that's where that comes from. I don't really proclaim to be the master of anything, but if I am, it probably would be leftovers. Having said that, I've had some incredible fails, as I'm sure you will if you try things. I remember I made an elk lasagna once in college with some of my roommates' leftover elk meat. It was absolutely horrible. It was the worst combination of wild, gamey meat and Italian seasoning. And you know what? When you're in college, you don't have any money, and food is food. So it was a fail, but we ate it anyway. This looks like it's about ready to assemble. So I've got a couple of pans out, and part of that is because I'm not a professional cook, so I'm not exactly sure which pan this is going to fit in. So that looks like not too bad in terms of judgment. I had a little bit of a smaller one too. Again, one of the things I'm looking for is just the ratio. I want to be able to get my potatoes on top. I might actually put it in a smaller pan. I think that's going to fit a little bit better. So we've got our previously whipped potatoes. And again, this is a topping. So we're just going to kind of start spreading these on top. And I added that milk, that cream, that butter to some otherwise kind of dryish potatoes to give them a little bit more of that whipped appearance. Part of why I went with this pan was because of the volume of my potatoes. So I wanted to make sure that I had coverage of the dish with all of my potatoes that were put in there. And so there wasn't these gaps where the meat was coming up in between. Waste not, want not, right? Okay, so this is our dish ready to go. Now I had heated our oven back to 400 degrees. Now we might have to broil it a little bit towards the end because we really want the top of those potatoes to get kind of a brownish crust. So we'll throw this in. Keep in mind everything's cooked, so everything's just mixing and warming at this point, so it doesn't need to cook for a long time. We're just going to cook it enough to let all those juices run together, soak into the potatoes a little bit, maybe brown the tops of them, crispen them up, and see how things turn out. Okay, so we're back. We had that in the oven for about 30 minutes. I did put the broiler on for the last few minutes. Again, I kind of want to go for that really nice, crisp, crusty outer part of the potato. Last few minutes. But the only comment on that, anybody who cooks knows that you got to keep an eye on it when you do that. Not a good time to go take a break. So the only other thing you might notice is I use this time. I don't have any kitchen help. Nobody came in, no staff members or anything like that swooped in and cleaned up. But we did take advantage of our downtime while it was in the oven. Got everything cleaned up, ready to go. So all we got to do is sit down and eat once it comes out of the oven. So our timer went off, and we'll check things out here. And here's our dish, ready for supper. Shepherd's pie, voila. All right, so in less than an hour, we've got dinner on the table, and that includes a half hour of cooking time. So we pulled everything out, whipped it up, kind of threw it together in a pan, and assembled a good dinner for the night. This is what we're trying to do on Leftover Master. Make simple dinners, use our leftovers, avoid waste, and have a little fun while we're doing it. So don't forget to follow us on Instagram and hit the notification bell if you want to know when our next episode is happening. Thanks for joining us.